Hello, it's Jimmy, and I'm going to be taking part in the Books for the Brave readathon, which is going to go on from May the 11th to May the 17th. And I'll go on and talk about that a bit more in a moment. But first, I just wanted to float an idea, which I don't want to hijack the Books for the Brave concept or anything like that, but it's given me this idea, which is there's a lot of small independent publishers, independent bookshops, and people who work for bookshops who have been struggling a lot because of the coronavirus situation. There was an article in The Guardian today saying that more than half of the small independent publishers that they had surveyed had said they were worried they might go out of business this year because of drop off sales because of the coronavirus. And that's obviously a terrible thing. A lot of these small independent publishers are publishing, they're doing interesting, innovative, creative things, publishing voices who aren't getting a place elsewhere. And often the more innovative things that end up happening in sort of mainstream publishing with large publishers was done first a few years earlier by these small indie publishers. So the experiments and the risks they take end up having a big knock-on effect on the whole industry, even if you don't read books published directly by them. So there's a few indie publishers that have set up little fundraisers. There's also a fundraiser being administered by a charity called BTBS, which provides grants to people who work for bookshops or directly to small independent bookshops themselves who are affected by the current situation to help them pay their bills. So would anyone be interested in doing a similar kind of readathon, maybe in the last week of May, to draw attention to these indie publishers and these fundraisers for independent bookshops and independent publishers, and draw attention to them, to the great work they do, the great books they do, and their fundraisers, maybe raise a bit of money for them, and give a boost to this small and vulnerable part of this industry that is so important to all of us as book lovers. So is that something anyone would be interested in? Is it a good idea? And if we were going to do a readathon or something like that, would anyone be interested in co-hosting? So, as I say, I don't want to hijack the platform of Books of the Brave, which I'm going to be taking part in, and is what I'm going to be talking about now. But I just wanted to bring that up just as another idea for something else we might do in a similar vein in a couple of weeks' time, maybe. So, Books for the Brave, as I said, it's running from the 11th to the 17th of May, and it is being hosted by Emma at Drinking by My Shelf, Leanne from Literary Diversions, and Victoria from What Victoria Read. And it is raising money for NHS Charities Together. And the concept is, they've put a GoFundMe together, I think, to raise money for this charity. And the idea is you should read books that you've already got. Don't buy new books for the readathon. And then donate the money that you would have spent on those books to the fundraiser, if you can afford to do so. Otherwise, taking part, sharing the link, sharing awareness can help as well. So one thing that I thought was important to raise was actually brought up by Emma at Drinking by Herself, which I really appreciated her talking about in her video, in her announcement video for the readathon. She said, "I do not want the NHS to become a charity. Looking after healthcare workers should not become a charitable endeavour." And I completely agree with that. I think that it's important not to normalise the idea that the public should be funding through generous donations and charitable donations and sort of small-scale philanthropy, that we should be funding the NHS that way. It's a public service that's been funded by public money for decades, and it's important that we expect the government to properly fund the NHS, and we should hold the government to account to make sure that this really important public service is properly funded through public money, so that it doesn't depend on whether individuals can afford to spare extra. We already pay for the NHS through our taxes as a nation, and that should be how it's funded. But that said, as Emma pointed out, these aren't ordinary times, and this charity does provide support to NHS staff, and support that perhaps should be funded by the government. So again, that's something that we should be campaigning for and should be a big part of the conversation going forward. But in the meantime, this is a point of desperate need, and hopefully we can provide a little bit of extra support to the people who are putting themselves on the front line and doing so much to keep everyone as healthy as possible during this unprecedented pandemic. And I became aware of this readathon thanks to an NHS doctor, Sarah at Your True Shelf. She is a fantastic YouTuber, booktuber. If you don't subscribe to her, I highly recommend it. She's also a parent, an NHS doctor, as I said. She does so much. If you watch her vlogs, you think, how is she doing all of this parenting, this hard work at the front lines of a pandemic, this exercise, this cooking? I don't know how she fits it all into her day, on top of reading, not to mention making booktube videos. So she's really inspiring, and she's participating in this readathon, and that inspired me to get involved as well. So what books am I going to read? There are 3 prompts for the readathon. One is a book that intimidates you, and the idea is it doesn't just have to be a gigantic tome with hundreds and thousands of pages that scares you on the shelf. It can be a book that intimidates you in other ways. So I've gone for Made in Saturn by Rita, Indiana. And this is published by a small publisher that's local to me called And Other Stories. And they previously published Rita, Indiana's other book, Tentacle, which I read last year. And when I read Tentacle, I wasn't sure what I thought about it. I think in my video I said I didn't particularly like it, or I didn't like it as much as I hoped. But although I had mixed feelings about it when I read it, it's one of the books that has most stuck in my head out of any book I've ever read, really. I kept thinking about it. I kept bringing it up with people, recommending it with people for months and months after I read it. And it's quite a small book, so there's a lot of sort of prompts for thought per page in Tentacle. It was very intense. So this is why I've picked Made in Saturn as a book that I'm intimidated by. It's not particularly long, but the mind of Rita, Indiana is not one that you can wander into whistling a tune like a stroll in the park. It's going to be intense, I'm sure. I haven't looked up the blurb or anything, but just on the strength of the author and the publisher, it's translated from Spanish, which is nice to read some translated fiction. So I am looking forward to it, but I am a bit intimidated and wondering if I'm going to come out of it slightly disturbed like I did with Rita, Indiana's other book, Tentacle. The next prompt is read a book with a brave character. So for this, I'm going for another book from a small press. There's a very small press called 3 of Cups, and they have published a number of anthologies, and I'm going to read a book called On Anxiety. So it's a collection of different kinds of writing as far as I know. I think there's some poetry, some fiction stories, short stories, possibly some non-fiction stories, and they all revolve around the author's experience of anxiety, or they're expressing something about anxiety. So I thought that qualified for the brave prompt, because to publicly speak and publish your experiences and thoughts on anxiety can be an intimidating thing to do, and it's quite brave of someone who experiences anxiety to put themselves out there in that way. So I think everyone who contributed to that anthology must be a brave person. So I'm looking forward to reading that, On Anxiety, an anthology from 3 of Cups. And the third and final prompt is read a book with N, H or S in the title. So I've been a bit cheeky with this, and I'm going to read The Prick by Mazin Salim. And this is published by a small press as well called Open Pen. They published these sort of novellas. I think they call them novelettes, but they're sort of 80 to 100 or so pages. They're basically novellas. I recently read one called Shitstorm, which was intense. As you can tell from the titles, they're irreverent, and based on the one I've read, it was quite funny and satirical. And I went to an event where this author, Mazin Salim, read out a much shorter one of his stories, and I thought it was really funny. I really liked the concept. So they were selling this book at the event, so I bought it. That was a few months ago. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But it is a bit cheeky because the only NH or S in the title is the H in the word the. But it's within the rules, so I'm going with it. So those are my 3 books. I'll put some links in the description to the announcement videos from the 3 hosts. I'll put a link into Sarah's channel at Your Truth Shelf. Definitely check her out if you haven't already. And I'll put a link to the fundraising page. So even if you're not taking part, please do. If you have some spare cash, go and support the fundraiser for the NHS Charities Together for the Books for the Brave readathon. I'll put a bit of information about some of the indie presses and their fundraisers that we might want to support if we do the thing that I suggested at the beginning. So yeah, let me know in the comments what you think about that. And in the meantime, stay home, stay safe, protect the NHS, give the workers the PPE, pay them properly, fund the NHS properly, and I'll talk to you soon.